Hi there, everybody. Mike Iscovitz here with a very somber Mondays with Mike. We just had a almost unimaginable catastrophe take place early in the morning on the 4th of July, and then through the 4th of July weekend in the Texas Hill Country, in the community of Hunt and Kerrville, Texas, and then also later on in the weekend closer to Austin and Burnett County, Travis County, Marble Falls, and those areas. So this morning, I feel compelled to talk about that and to share as much knowledge as I have, having been in this business and predicting, covering um, severe weather events, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods for 25 years here in Texas. And I've seen just about everything. This is one of the worst. It really is one of the worst that I've seen. So there's a few things that I want to talk to you about, and they include some things that are probably going to be a little controversial. They shouldn't be, but there's a very politically charged environment out there right now, and some of the factors that we need to talk about, that we need to take a serious look at, involve some aspects of politics. And so I'm not going to talk specifically around politics. I'm going to try to stick to the facts that I know, and also my professional opinion about the weather and emergency response aspects of all of this. Nothing at all political. Okay, please. Don't get mad at me. I had some posts that I put on TikTok and Instagram over the weekend because, look, I'm as shocked by all of this as most of America is. And especially from the perspective of a forecaster, I know a lot of us, and the forecasters with the National Weather Service out there, I'm sure, are feeling a tremendous amount of stress and grief and everything else because you want to save as many people as you can. And it's frustrating to not always be able to have all of the warnings, all of the urgent life-saving warnings sent out in a timely manner. So I've made a list of a few points that I want to talk about. And the first thing was warning systems. Second thing is taking proper precautions if you're under a flash flood watch or under flash flood warnings, but especially flash flood watch, because that's what would have given everybody a very long heads up. The other is National Weather Service advisories and how they're disseminated, and whether or not I think that they were adequate. Here's where it gets political: National Weather Service staffing cuts. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. I'll tell you what I know from firsthand knowledge and from what I've seen, from what I've heard from trusted sources. We're going to be talking about predicting freak events. And finally, here we get political again, which it shouldn't be: misinformation online that is spreading like wildfire, and it's disappointing. So let's talk about warning systems. So, and this actually ties in with the National Weather Service advisories too, but this catastrophe, and if you haven't heard by now, I'm sure you have, but to summarize everything, overnight during the very, very early morning hours of the 4th of July, there was a deluge of rain that was about 1 foot of rain that came down in a very short amount of time, less than a couple of hours. And this happened in the Texas Hill Country, which sometimes has been called Flash Flood Alley. You know how we talk about Tornado Alley, right? Where so many deadly and large tornadoes form. The Flash Flood Alley, which we don't talk about that often, but it is an area that has a reputation for flash flooding. Why? Well, because we get very heavy rain in Texas because of the Gulf moisture that's in place often, and also it's a hilly area with a lot of rivers. And when you have very heavy rainfall that flows into an area with terrain, we saw that with Hurricane Helene when the remnants moved into North Carolina, right? Western parts of North Carolina, you had mountains, you had valleys, you had tropical moisture, and you had a historic disaster there. Well, this was a little bit of a similar type of thing. There was remnant tropical moisture from what was left of Tropical Storm Barry. And I want to give you my opinion. This was not Tropical Storm Barry that hit, but it was a lot of moisture tied in with Tropical Storm Barry, and maybe even some remnant circulation, or what you could call vorticity, in the mid-levels of the atmosphere from Barry. So did Barry play a role in this? Definitely. Probably a big role, yes. So what's the problem with warning systems? Well, this happened in the middle of the night, and I'm just going to use one example, which is the tragedy that's been getting a lot of the attention, which is Camp Mystic, which is in Hunt, Texas, along the banks of the Guadalupe River. And why they were caught completely off guard. Now, a lot of people will say, hey, wait a minute. And I've seen these people making the argument online. Hey, wait a minute. There were flash flood warnings that were in effect. The Weather Service let everybody know. And yes, they did. That's true. But we need to look back and say, how do you get word of a flash flood emergency to a bunch of sleeping children and their chaperones at 4 a.m.? There needs to be a more urgent alert system. It has to happen. Apparently, this has been looked into in the past in Kerr County, and the Kerr County judge said that it was too expensive and that taxpayers didn't want to pay for it. And that's a shame. Now, more details will eventually come out about what was proposed as far as warning systems, but I think everyone out there in the Hill Country, and even here in the Houston area, we probably need to start thinking more seriously about how we direct emergency warnings to people. Now, the problem out there is that they get flash flood warnings all the time. A lot of times we do too, on heavy rain days in Houston, many, many times. You'll get an alert on your phone that says Harris County is under a flash flood warning, or maybe, I'm just throwing out names here. Jersey Village, Cypress, Tomball are under a flash flood warning until 6 p.m. And what that amounts to is street flooding, and maybe if it gets really bad, you might have some roads closed, or if it gets really horrible, it might get in some neighborhoods. But it's not like they have in the Hill Country, where you have rushing water, torrents of water, where we had this 20-foot, basically, like a tsunami of water that swept through this campground in Hunt, Texas. So how do we, and this is something, I don't know the solution, but I'm kind of throwing it out there, asking everybody, how do we as communities and as a country take the resources that we have and empower the National Weather Service to send out these emergency alerts that will be sent specifically to areas that are in the path of deadly weather. So for example, that there are areas, especially in North Texas, but some other cities, where there are tornado sirens. So we know that exists, and that way it's not like you have to rely on looking at an app on your phone to get an alert, which not everybody does. You have a blaring siren that nobody can ignore. So if there was something similar along the Guadalupe River when it became clear, because if you haven't been keeping up with it, that river rose 20 feet in an hour. So when that, and we have river gauges, we have measurements there. So, the computers, the gauges would have known that the river had risen 20 feet in an hour. And you could have, come up with some sort of alert system where if the water rises X amount of feet in X amount of time, that it sends out sort of an audible alert. I don't know if that means a siren. I don't know if that means like a push alert to everybody in the area, like an Amber Alert. I don't know what that could be, but something like that, something that can't be ignored. Because when it comes to, my second point, which was proper precautions for a flash flood watch, we're under flash flood watches pretty often. If there's going to be a day in which we have heavy rain on the way, and especially if we've had heavy rain for the last couple of days, sometimes parts of our area here in Houston will be placed under a flood watch. And a flood watch means conditions are favorable for flooding. Most people don't necessarily completely change their plans or plan on a wall of water coming through, right? But if you had plans to go to the banks of a river or to camp on the banks of a river, or maybe you RV, things like that, I think we need to now raise our level of awareness, not just here in Texas, but everywhere in the country, to say if there's a watch issued by the National Weather Service, then they do that for a reason. And maybe me, as a member of the media and as a weather communicator, I probably need to express that much more strongly, to say we're under a watch and here's what could happen and these are the precautions you should take. It's not going to affect most people, but if you're in a floodplain or you're near a river or you're at, let's say at a campsite next to a river, there are special precautions that should be taken, prevention measures that should be taken. And maybe that wasn't communicated well enough. So you have that combined with the fact that there wasn't like a blaring, unmistakable, non-ignorable warning system, could have really led to a lot of the just tragedy that we saw. Something very unusual happened the day on the 4th of July, which was that the emergency managers for the state of Texas appeared to be blaming, or if not explicitly blaming, then sort of putting the responsibility onto the National Weather Service by saying that they weren't warned how much rain could fall. Now, here's the thing. I'm not privy to any of the conversations that happened between the National Weather Service and the state emergency managers, but I'll tell you that the public discussions issued by the National Weather Service said 2 to 3 inches of rain area-wide, with isolated amounts of 3 to 6 inches, and then in their area forecast discussion that evening, they mentioned 5 to 7 inches. So 7 inches on the high side. So what ended up happening was this one area got 12 inches. So yes, that is a big diversion from the forecast, and there's no doubting that. However, my experience as a forecaster is that it's almost impossible to predict freak events. So, gosh, I mean, you could think about this in any line of work, and my mind thinks in analogies. So that bothers my wife sometimes, because I always try to give an analogy and she's like, shut up. But, when you think about anything like preparing for, let's say this could have been something like a plane crash, okay? Think about that when you have a massive loss of life that happens all at the same time. And the designers of the aircraft try to account for everything. They have triple redundant systems. The airplane can take a lightning strike. It can take a bird strike. It's made to fly on one engine, just all of that stuff, right? But there are going to be circumstances that happen that are just so, out of the realm of imagination, that the plane fails and there's a crash. Just an absolute freak occurrence. I mean, it does happen. So, and similar things can happen with the weather. I'm sure if all of those forecasters had a chance to go back in time, they would have said, yes, there could be a catastrophic flash flood in the worst case scenario that's not expected. What I wanted to ask the emergency managers, though, was when they said that they were only warned of 5 to 7 inches and not 12 inches, I want to ask them, what would you have done differently if the Weather Service had put wording in their discussion that up to 12 inches was not impossible? What would you have done differently? And my thought is probably not much. That's my opinion. I want to talk about something that is controversial, and I feel that it's my duty to talk about it, and that is staffing cuts at the National Weather Service. I will tell you that the meteorologist in charge at that local Weather Service office in Central Texas has said that he had 5 people on staff that night, and that they always are overstaffed for big events like this. And so I'm inclined to completely take him at his word that they were properly staffed that night. But it doesn't take away from the issue that is 100% real. It is apolitical, which is that there are open weather positions, and I'll tell you why. Now, I don't know for a fact, and you don't know for a fact, nobody knows at this point, did any staffing or budget cuts delay or in any way affect the forecasts that came out? I don't know. But I will tell you this, and this is something that it's going to be hard for you to disagree with me on because I have, so-called the receipts, okay? As of right now, I'm going to talk about our local National Weather Service office in Houston, Galveston, which is, we're just adjacent, by the way. We're the next office over from where this event happened. Our local office, the top 3 positions, the most senior positions, are currently vacant. So the meteorologist in charge, who's like the captain of the ship, okay? The science operations officer, who is the head researcher, basically, head scientist, and then the warning coordination meteorologist, who is in charge of warnings, tornado warnings, flash flood warnings, severe thunderstorm warnings, all of that kind of stuff, declaring flash flood emergencies, all of that. All 3 of those positions are vacant. There are, let's see, that's 3. There are 2 more vacancies, I believe, for a total of 5. And then I think there are 2 others. I think the total is 7 when you look for the supervisory positions, the forecaster positions, and like the junior forecaster positions. 7 vacancies right now at our local office. And the jobs are not listed on the government website. In other words, you can't apply for the job right now. The office that was in charge of forecasting for this flooding event, which is the EWX office, it's in New Braunfels, Texas, which is between San Antonio and Austin. They currently have 5 vacancies in that office, including a hydrologist position. Hydrologist meaning the ones who forecast for hydro, water. So the meteorologist in charge there says that they had it covered. They had 5 people on staff. I have absolutely no reason to doubt what he's saying. And I think that they all did the best they could with the information and the tools that they had. But it's indisputable here. Now, a lot of people, because I mentioned this online, people got mad at me, and people get mad about everything, saying, well, the cuts haven't kicked in yet, and the government cuts haven't kicked in. Yes, they did. Okay. So you may recall that earlier this fall, the Doge cuts, okay, buyouts were offered. So what happened was twofold. There were some people who retired last fall before any of this, before any of the political stuff happened. They retired. Their position was not filled because of hiring freezes that went into effect during the Doge cuts. And then some people took the Doge buyouts, basically early retirement buyouts, which is why you end up with the 3 senior positions all vacant. And there are a lot of weather service offices around the country where you don't just, because think about who's going to take a retirement buyout. It's not somebody who's been with the Weather Service for 2 years. It's probably somebody who's been with the Weather Service for 25 years or 30 years. So it's the senior, most experienced, most knowledgeable leaders who took the buyouts. I hope that makes sense to you. So is that a factor in this tragedy? I don't know, but it is a factor in weather forecasting in general. All right. Finally, need to talk about some of the misinformation out there. Look, I'm going to level with you. Cloud seeding exists, okay? It is a thing. But just because cloud seeding is a thing does not mean that it causes flash flooding, okay? There are small scale effects that cloud seeding can have. First of all, you need to have a cloud already there. You need to have what's called supercooled cloud droplets. You have saturation taking place already at cloud level, and then what's dropped into the cloud acts as a nucleus for the raindrops to the cloud droplets to form onto and eventually become raindrops. It has something like a 0 to 20% impact on the amount of rain that falls, okay? There's zero indication that any cloud seeding was taking place on this day involving this storm at all. There is a program in place in various states where they're experimenting with this kind of stuff, but it hasn't, just because one thing happens doesn't mean that it affects the other thing, all right? So there's that. Then there's people putting pictures of radar. You know, if you see any pictures of radar coming up with spikes coming off of it and all that, that's not what the radar is sending out. That's what the radar is receiving. It's displaying what it receives. And I'll give you a perfect example. Our radar here at Fox 26 will sometimes get interference where we get a spike that comes from a Wi-Fi signal that happens to share the same frequency as our radar. So that kind of stuff happens. You get spikes at sunrise and sunset. That's very well known. You get spikes if they're different. You know, you're talking about a radio wave or a microwave being sent out, and there are other things out there, whether it be Wi-Fi networks or anything like that, that may temporarily overlap the same frequency and give some false returns. It happens. It's scientifically, I mean, you know, I'm not an electrical engineer, but it happens. That's the explanation. It's not, they're not sending out laser beams. It's just not what it is. So, you know, sometimes you have to trust the experts. This is a terrible catastrophe. My final thoughts after rambling are that we need to restore funding to NOAA. We need to install emergency flood systems that have audio blaring, kind of ignorable kind of warnings to them. All of us need to do a better job getting word out about what the actual dangers are and what steps people should take to avoid catastrophe. And just that this is a freak event. And freak events that are outside of any, you know, almost any precedent or the type of thing that happens every 40 or 50 years is very difficult to predict. So that'll do it. You know, the other thing is, you know, I'm really sickened by some of the comments that people are saying online about, especially about the children, but about anybody. It's really disgusting. And I don't want to get into it because it makes me upset, but don't do that. So anyway, that'll do it for Somber Mondays with Mike today. Really, you know, just all of our thoughts are with the families who are dealing with this unimaginable suffering right now in Central Texas. And, you know, you just hope that eventually something good comes of this, but it's certainly hard to see that now. All right, that'll do it for today's Mondays with Mike. See you next week.